Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd and this is my review of episode 8 of season 5 of Lower Decks called Upper Decks. And this episode focuses on the bridge crew this time, and our usual team of lower deckers are not in most of the episode and are not even aware of what's happening on the ship. So the idea was great, but the execution was a little bit jumbled, meaning too many things were happening too quickly. And usually I like fast pacing, I don't like slow, boring stories that take too long, but in this case it was on the other end of the extreme. Like, it was way too many things happening too quickly, and it was a little bit jumbled, so maybe they went a little bit too far in a few places. And as usual, there are a lot of references, this time not just about Star Trek, but I also feel there were a few references to other movies. Like, in the beginning, Mariner mentions some adventure she had on some planet in which she got stuck inside a painting. That kind of reminded me of a movie with Robin Williams. And I think Keiko was in that movie too, if I'm not mistaken. It's been a long time since I saw it. But anyway, they reference a lot of things happening off screen in this episode, so it kind of leaves it to our imagination. So maybe I'm reaching, but I get the sense that there were deliberate references to other movies. For example, there was a scene when a man was apparently pregnant and was about to give birth, and so I was about to roll my eyes at that because, that's the usual woke stuff in the new Trek shows, but then they revealed he was actually not human but an alien, and then a bunch of tentacles came out of him, so that reminded me of a scene in Men in Black when an alien in human form was given birth and there were a bunch of tentacles coming out. Also, there was some scientist guy in the episode who was from the same species as the Federation president whom we saw in Deep Space Nine, and then he gets injured and it's revealed that he's actually an insectoid alien in disguise, and then he takes off his skin and reveals his true form, so that's also similar to the ending of Men in Black when that bug was inside the Edgar suit. And also, the way they showed the effect of his flesh coming off looked really similar to the ending of The Fly, which is one of the classic science fiction movies of the 80s. So when this guy reveals himself to be an insectoid in disguise, his flesh comes off in a very similar way visually, and so I think it's probably not a coincidence. There were also a lot of references to other Trek episodes. For example, the captain was attending some kind of play by someone, and then that bald guy falls asleep, and then she wakes him up, and then he wakes up clapping. That's exactly like that scene in TNG with Riker. And when Ransom tries to give some kind of pep talk to his officers, he puts his leg up on something just like Riker. And there are all those scenes with those space cow creatures who can curl up into balls, and someone says that we should be worried about its feelings or something. All of that reminded me of the tardigrade from Discovery, which was kind of similar. And maybe the funniest scene to me was when that AI golem was coming out of the view screen and grabbed the chief engineer, and then he was telling that other officer that you can only shut it off if you press the power button, but also tell a sad childhood story at the same time. And then she tries to do that, and that immediately reminded me of Discovery, which had so many scenes of random characters suddenly having to tell sad stories from their childhood about some past trauma and stuff like that. So when he told her that she has to do that, and then she cannot really come up with something, so she says, one time my dad and I went to the beach and I saw a dead fish there, and then he tells her that's not sad enough. So that was really funny to me personally, because I was the one making compilations of that kind of scene from Discovery, because they did it so many times it became like comedy to me. And so I'm pretty sure they were deliberately poking fun at those kinds of scenes from Discovery in this scene. And so that was the most funny one. And also there's a subplot with Shax, who has to fight off his demons, and he's doing some kind of ceremony when he has to fight some astral projection of his past self, who is still traumatized from the war with the Cardassians. And I think it's similar to all kinds of scenes we saw in Deep Space Nine, and even in Voyager there was an episode about some Bajoran who did some ritual and it revived some old memory. And also they poked fun at all the episodes when crew members got de-evolved or evolved into all kinds of different creatures, and so they say this woman got changed into a futuristic caveman, and so she both evolved and de-evolved at the same time. So that's kind of poking fun at the bad biological technobabble of Star Trek, because a lot of times they kind of misunderstood evolution, a lot of times they explain all the bizarre things with very bad science. And so, one time everyone on the Enterprise D de-evolved into animals, even though we don't directly descend from spiders, but Barclay somehow de-evolved into a spider, and Spot transformed into an iguana, even though cats are not descended from those kinds of creatures. And also, we don't have the genetic blueprints of all the other creatures on Earth in our DNA, and so it doesn't work like that. And also that time in Voyager, when Tom Paris was said to be evolving, and yet he transformed into a more primitive creature, apparently, so that was silly. By the way, I think that episode of Voyager was also kind of a homage to The Fly, because there was a lot of similar scenes also when Tom Paris removed his tongue from his mouth and he said that he's getting better and not worse. And so I think that episode was kind of trying to be The Fly, but they didn't want to use the transporter because that would be too similar. It would be too much of a copyright infringement maybe, so that's why they had to come up with some other way to do it. And so they made up that whole warp 10 travel stuff, which was even more ridiculous in the context of Voyager, which cannot even get back home in the same galaxy, and yet they can travel at infinite speed. So that was even more ridiculous in the context of Voyager as a show. But anyway, I'm getting off topic. So back to this episode. So there are a lot of similar stuff to stuff that happened in all the other Star Trek shows, and so it felt a little bit jumbled because there were just too many things happening at once. And the chief engineer is trying to fix something and it keeps getting worse and worse, and then he's behind some glass saying goodbye to his crew member because he's apparently about to die. So that was similar to how Spock said goodbye to Kirk when he was dying. And by the way, a lot of people keep asking me to review that fan movie that showed Kirk and Spock using deepfake technology. So yes, I think that was great. And as I mentioned in my review of Alien Romulus, I do think deepfake technology opens up so many new possibilities. We can basically bring back any actor we want from any time in history and do whatever we want with it. And so of course it opens up the door to endless possibilities, and so I think that's great. I'll do a proper longer review of that stuff later. So anyway, it turns out that Federation scientist is actually an insectoid in disguise, because those insect villains want to steal those creatures because they have cloaking abilities. When they turn into those balls, they can also cloak themselves, and so the bug aliens want to steal them to get that ability for themselves. And then they discover they have a weakness that these aliens cannot stand being complimented, and so if you say something good to them, they experience it as pain and they cannot stand it. So that kind of reminds me of those aliens from Mars that we saw in that movie about the Mars invasion, and those aliens couldn't stand some specific music and their heads blew up, and so that reminded me of that. And the episode also ends with Mariner's dad, who is an admiral who comes to visit the captain, and they have a date on the holodeck. It's kind of strange how he doesn't bother to visit his own daughter, Mariner, who is on the same ship, and it's so rare that he comes to visit them, and yet he never bothers to visit his own daughter. That was a little bit strange. And the subplot I liked the least was the one with the doctor, who they said in the beginning is not doing a very good job as a doctor of making sure her patients do not suffer pain, and so she wants to update her pain charts, and so she undergoes some kind of self-experiment and endures all kinds of pain. And so on top of everything, she's also a masochist apparently, since she seems to be totally fine with being tortured in all kinds of ways. So I found that subplot to be the least entertaining, the least funny, and this character overall I think is the most annoying in the show. Like, I get why it might be funny sometimes, but she's being obnoxious all the time, and it's kind of getting too much in my opinion. I mean, this is almost like the level of Itchy and Scratchy from The Simpsons, which I remember as a kid that was my favorite part from The Simpsons, because it was so outrageous how gory all that stuff was inside the cartoon. So that's why it was so funny, but it was funny in small doses. If you watch an entire show of that, that will be kind of too much. So that's how I feel like with this character of this doctor who is totally nuts, obviously, and shouldn't be in Starfleet. And it brings the question, should this show even be considered canon, since it's doing so many crazy things that shouldn't really be happening in any kind of serious science fiction? And, because they showed up in Strange New Worlds as actual characters, and that means the show is actually canon, it's part of the Star Trek universe, And for the most part, I'm fine with it, but it's just all those times when the show goes too far and becomes too crazy, and so it's kind of hard to accept it as actual history in Star Trek, as if all these events actually happened. So one way to settle it, I guess, is by saying maybe the cartoon version that we see is not exactly how it really is like in the live action version, meaning it's kind of an exaggerated version of what actually happened with them, as if someone is retelling it, or as if someone made a show about them and did it in an animated form with all kinds of jokes added. And so I guess we can settle it that way, that something similar did happen in the actual Star Trek history, but not exactly as we see it in this cartoon with all the crazy stuff happening. Meaning a more moderate, more realistic version of these events is what actually happened. So that's my opinion. Let me know what you think, and we can discuss it all in the comments below. And I will see you all next time. Bye bye.